believe me, I'm disappointed. All right. Like, if USC had made the playoff, like, that's really good for Trojans Wire. It's really good for my website. It's really good for my, the profession I'm in. It's really good for my bottom line. Like, I missed out. Like, I lost something material and tangible as a result of USC not winning that game. So, like, it affects me negatively in terms of, the bonuses and incentives I can make at my job and publicity that we're going to get, and the amount of, non-voice of college football media involvements that I'll do with other publications, outlets, radio stations across the country. So it negatively affects me. All right. So, like, it sucks. Okay. But just in terms of, being an analyst, just in terms of following this sport, which I've done professionally for 2 decades and which I've been watching for 40 years, the first game the first college football game I ever remember watching, 1981 Gator Bowl, North Carolina, Arkansas, okay, in the Jacksonville Fog. And so, that was Dick Crum's, really good late 70s, early 1980s North Carolina teams. And in that 81 Gator Bowl was against Lou Holtz, who did such a very good job with Arkansas when it was still in the Southwest Conference. That's the first college football game I ever remember watching. So I've seen a lot of college football. I've followed this sport for 40 years and covered it for roughly half of that, 20. So, like, I've been around the block, and I can just say that USC did not have a college football playoff level roster. And that is something that we talked about all off season on your show at the Voice of College Football. So, like I said last week, as we prepared for this Pac-12 championship game, like, I undersold Lincoln Riley and USC. I thought they'd win 10. They won 11. And I did think they'd make the Pac-12 championship game. But, like, I wasn't expecting 11-1, and I wasn't expecting this team to be 1 win from the playoff. Again, it's really disappointing. And I'm frustrated that, I won't get to cover the playoff and get, hundreds of thousands of the added page views that I would stand to get if USC had been in the playoff. But this was not a playoff roster. So, like, I can just look at that reality and say, hey, like, this is pretty much how it was supposed to be, or at least, like, this is where the ceiling was with this team. The ceiling was not as high as we had wanted it to be, or as we had hoped, but the ceiling was as high as we thought. Not, the hope, what you hope for, but what you rationally and analytically think, those are different things. And so, just as an analyst, someone who is, supposed to know how to calibrate certain opinions, expectations, like, this met my expectations. And Utah had a physical team, and Utah also had a deep team. And I talked about Larry Pilgrim, our friend here at the Voice of College Football, our best Utah analyst, the guy who has really good, detailed, granular insights into the Utah program. He said that Utah was going to hold down USC in this game. He said this was going to be more of a better defensive performance from the Utah side than what we saw in October. And he said that Utah was gonna have better answers, and it did. And one of the key points that Larry made was that Utah's backups, because remember, no Van Fillinger, all right, no Jonah Ellis. You didn't have 2 of your prime guys on your defensive front. I mean, so Caleb Williams, had his mobility limited. That, so injuries affected USC. You had Andrew Voorhees out. That affected USC. I think one can say coming out of this game that Caleb Williams is the most important player, the most valuable player on USC. And I think you have to put Voorhees second ahead of Travis Dye, because Austin Jones filled in for Travis Dye and did really, really well. But without Voorhees in there for run blocking, you saw how USC's offensive line suffered. And one of the things I emphasized on the Saturday morning show, for anyone who didn't see it here on the Voice of College Football, I made the simple point that against Arizona, against Cal, against Colorado, having Mason Murphy in there as a backup on the offensive line didn't matter, or at least it didn't matter that much. USC still able to ring up the big numbers, score in the 40s, get some wins. It was fine. But Mason Murphy against Utah, even Utah's backups on the defensive front, nope, couldn't get away with that. And that, again, meshes with something we talked about all off season and into early September on your show, Mark, here at the Voice of College Football, that if you got past the top guys on the depth chart on the offensive line and you put those guys against quality opposition, not Arizona, Cal, Colorado, all right? Those were junior varsity games. But you put them up against the varsity, such as Utah, it's going to show up. And it did. So, again, all of this sucks. I wanted to cover a playoff team. I wanted to cover a playoff semifinal. It really affects me materially. My wallet's going to be lighter than it otherwise would have been. But as an analyst, as someone who has watched a lot of football, and who basically knew the score in terms of what USC needed and where USC was thin and how big and how small the margin of error was with this team, couldn't afford an Andrew Voorhees injury against Utah. It could against Arizona, Cal, Colorado, not against Utah. Utah is the big leagues. And this is why Kyle Whittingham and all the patient program building that he's done over several years, it mattered and it showed up. And this is where the idea of, not being able to, or, trying to remake a team in 1 year has its limitations, right? That makes sense. Lincoln Riley being able to change a team in 1 year, going from 4-8 to 11-2, you can do your own process internally and make your product dramatically better very quickly. All right. But that kind of exists in its own context against a full roster of opponents. But against the elite opponents, and it's fair to call Utah an elite opponent, and a defending Pac-12 champion, made the Rose Bowl, almost beat Ohio State. When you're playing against an established team like that, and Utah made the Pac-12 championship game in 2018 and 2019 before that, Utah was appearing in its fourth Pac-12 championship game in the past 5 seasons. When you're going up against that kind of established program, that is when the 1 year makeover runs into limitations, because you haven't built the depth. You haven't built quite as much accountability throughout the whole roster. Now, USC brought in a lot of stars, a lot of great starters, but in a game where depth and attrition were felt on both sides, it stands to reason that Utah's depth and Utah's backups were better than USC's. I mean, we can all appreciate that. That's a pretty logical outcome. And we can appreciate that if Voorhees had been able to play, this game's probably different, but he wasn't. And then again, that's where USC is. It's a program where the 1 year makeover went as well as it realistically could. But if depth ever became a concern, the Trojans were in trouble. And they surely were on Friday in Las Vegas. So when events are, not the way you want them, but they do fit the larger realities and scenarios that you had been talking about for months throughout the summer and into early September, there's only so much disappointment to feel, right? This is what this is what was possible. But this was something that we explored. This is something we anticipated, and it happened. And it sucks that it happened, but it did happen. And so there's only so much disappointment to go around. And I reemphasize one particular point that I made on the Saturday morning show is that, the real crushing disappointments in life and in sports occur when you know that everything is set up for you to succeed. It's all lined up. You have everything going your way. You have the depth. You have offense, defense balance. You have, all seniors, who all know what to do. Your backups are elite the way Nick Saban's backups were on his best Alabama teams. When just, you just plug and play. You can lose a starter here or there, and you have a 5-star stud who's just ready to go, hungry, and you don't have any drop off at any of the 22 positions, or at least close to that. When you're set, when you're fully set, you're fully loaded, and you still don't deliver, that's the crusher. That's the game that you never forget. That's the game that you'll never get over as long as you live. This is not one of those games, and this is not one of those seasons.